From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Karen Lloyd, Director of the Library's Veterans History Project.
We'll take it.
Today we are in for a real treat, with a nod to our upcoming exhibit, which opens on April 4th, 2017, on America's entry into World War I, appropriately named Echoes of the Great War, America's Experiences of World War I. This interview with a current leader of our military team seems a good fit. Today, Colleen Shogan will have a fireside chat with Eric Fanning, the Secretary of the Army. Since 2015, Colleen Shogan has served as Deputy Director of the Library's National and International Outreach. She joined the Library's Congressional Research Service in 2008 and served as the CRS Deputy Director from 2012 until 2015. Prior to joining CRS, she worked for 2 years on the legislative staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee. She is also a published author with 3 books and many academic authors to her credit. Our special guest, Secretary Eric Fanning, has had an extraordinary career. Secretary Fanning knows his way around the Pentagon, having served in jobs as diverse as Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Defense, Acting Secretary of the Air Force, Under Secretary of the Air Force and Chief Management Officer, Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy, Deputy Chief Management Officer, Acting Undersecretary of the Army, and Chief Management Officer. The enduring theme of his assignments relate to business transformation and governance to improve enterprise-wide efficiencies. He also spent time in a defense agency, so he has firsthand experience in a variety of aspects of the Department of Defense that provide him a depth of knowledge that is rare and extremely valuable. Secretary Fanning has also spent time with a variety of Washington, D.C. think tanks and as a research assistant with the House Armed Services Committee. It is an understatement to say we are fortunate to have such a defense expert with us today to help us better understand the importance of diversity, budget stability, and innovation. Let's welcome them both with a big round of applause.
Thanks, Karen. Good morning. And to all of our guests, welcome to the Library of Congress. We're very privileged and honored this morning to host Secretary Fanning here at the library. And the format for this morning, we have about 45 minutes for the conversation. If there is time left over, then Secretary Fanning will take questions from the audience. Mr. Secretary, you've had just really, as Karen said, a tremendous career in the Pentagon, largely in public service, in the public sector, but also in the private sector as well. Can you tell us when you first became interested in defense policy and when you knew that would be the focus of your career?
Well, I think my interest was in government and politics first. I went to school in New Hampshire, and I actually arrived as an art major. I wanted to be an architect. But when you go to school in New Hampshire, you're going to be there for a presidential primary at some point during your time. And it's not a big state, there aren't a lot of places for them to go, and they're there for a long time, so you get to see the process up close, and I knew I wanted to come back. I wanted to come to Washington, so I art major the first year, but come to Washington the summer after my freshman year, and am hooked on government, on politics, on the Congress in particular, and was sort of drawn to defense and foreign policy for a number of reasons. I have a pretty big military family. My father grew up at West Point. 2 of his brother-in-law went there. And it all kind of clicked because I got a job in the House Armed Services Committee. And that just sort of took off quickly because within 16 months, the chairman of the committee for whom I was working became Secretary of Defense. And so that was the path was set at an early point.
Okay. This is the Library of Congress. We're very interested in people who have had worked in the legislative branch, so I want to ask a little bit more about that. You started your career at House Armed Services and then, of course, went on to have a very distinguished career in the executive branch. From the positions that you've held in the Pentagon, when you look back at your time in Congress, was that very helpful to have had that experience working in the legislative branch? And can you talk a little bit about that?
It's very helpful. It's also very fun. I usually, when I'm advising younger people, I say, go to the Hill early, because it's a relatively flat structure. You can get a lot of responsibility very quickly, and also tire of it very quickly. But it's been helpful to me in every job that I've had. So much of what we do is interacting with Congress, our board of directors, essentially. And there's so little understanding outside of Congress of how it actually functions and how people think, how they operate. And so I had one meeting before coming over here this morning, and it was all about congressional issues and how to move things through our committees.
Mm-hmm. We have one more Congress-related question for you. The National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, has been enacted, I think, 55 years in a row without fail. And as you know, in this time of withering authorizations on the Hill, where it's very infrequent to see authorizations and certainly not on a routinized schedule, can you share with us why you think the NDAA has had its record of continued passage, and whether you think that even in this time of extreme polarization and partisanship on the Hill, whether defense still remains a bipartisan or an even nonpartisan issue with Congress?
Everything is political and partisan in one way or another, but it is a bastion of across the aisle efforts, the Armed Services Committee. I think that the bipartisan approach that we've taken for national security for decades, and a point of pride for those committees, is what drives an NDAA every year. It is remarkably bipartisan how those committees approach their work. I mean, just my confirmation process, which was really, the whole thing took place on the Republican side, the debate, the issues. My supporters were on the Republican side. We make an effort to work together across the aisle to keep communication open as much as possible. And what I found, it hit me really in an unexpected way at the start of the Obama administration. I'd worked in the Clinton Pentagon, was returning to the Obama Pentagon, and it's a lot of the same characters. A lot of the people who I work with in the Obama Pentagon, I worked with at an early point in all our careers in the Clinton Pentagon, and a lot of names, people on the Hill, members in particular, people that were around back then as well. And so those relationships survive and just evolve over time.
That's interesting. It's been years since I've worked with defense policy and worked in armed services, but when I went back to prepare for this interview, I was surprised at how many of the issues actually had remained very consistent and the same. So you've sat in many different seats in the Pentagon. You've worked in the Navy, you've worked in the Air Force, you've worked in the SecDef office. We're going to focus today on the Army because that's your current position. You talked a little bit about your confirmation hearing in particular. You said that you were concerned about decreasing Army end strength, but you also said that the Army is more than just a number. So I'd like to ask you about what the future of the Army looks like with a reduced force structure. Is the Army going to continue to be a conventional fighting force, or does it have to prepare for other endeavors and other challenges? And what does that mean for the training of our soldiers? Will they continue to be trained as warfighters, or will they need additional skills?
So there's about 12 questions.
Yeah, there's a lot.
I had to pull that one apart a little bit. At my confirmation hearing, I was focused on making sure that we were getting the most combat capability out of the force structure we have. Maybe too nuanced, but my own background and really focusing on how we're organized, how we're run, what the processes are, to get as agile and as efficient as possible so that whatever force structure we're given, whatever resource we're allotted, that we're getting the most bang for the buck out of it. It was interpreted as me saying we're cutting the Army too far, which caused me immediate problems with my boss, but we worked through that. The Army is run hard. The military is run hard. When we targeted this 900 and just over 980,000 total Army, the active, the Guard, and the Reserve, Russia wasn't being as provocative as it is now. China wasn't flexing in the way that it is now. ISIL didn't exist as it does today, and yet now we have all those new requirements levied on top of the force structure that we were aiming towards. What I would say, two things about force structure. A raw number doesn't necessarily tell you what an army is, what capabilities an army brings to a fight. And it's very important that we think in terms of a balanced program. It's not just people, it's people that are trained and equipped. And if we're asked to keep more force structure without an increase in the budget in some way, then we have more people with less training and less equipment. And that could quickly become a larger army that's less effective and less capable than the one that we're trying to build now. So the balance is important. It's not just the number of people that you have. It's how they're organized, how they're trained, and how they're equipped. As far as the future, I think that the broad requirements levied on the Army now, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, as well as preparing for a larger fight with a near-peer adversary, are going to remain into the future. The issue is how technology changes, how the adversary changes, and where you imagine the environment you might be fighting is changing or evolving. Because we know that we're on a trend to increased urbanization and mega cities, which creates all sorts of vulnerabilities for people when they're clustered together like that, which could create something on the back end of this trend. But we've got to think about being able to fight, increasingly fight in dense urban environments where the adversary is mixed in with large civilian populations.
Okay. The most recent QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, had a discussion of risk based upon some of the aging major weapon systems in the Army. The idea that we are still technically advanced beyond our adversaries, but the gap between the United States and our adversaries is actually decreasing, hence the risk. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about problems, and everybody reads about them in the news, concerning the acquisitions process, cost overruns, delayed deliverables. What is the crux of the development process, particularly in the Army? And if you had more time as secretary, how would you fix it?
So I think there are two things when we're talking about that risk. One is investment, and the Army, the nature of the fights in the last 15 years, has really been drawn into the day after day after day after day, and as it should, making sure that we have the size Army we need and that it is ready for today's fight. And that has meant leveraging the future in some ways and substantially cutting, just in the last 8 years, by upwards of a third our modernization budget. And so that's one part of that growing risk, because we're not maybe investing in modernization in the way we should be to think about the future 10, 15, 20 years out. The second, of course, is just the process, the acquisition procurement process. And the Army, a decade or so ago, was grappling with some very serious problems across its portfolio, programs that were suffering from pretty substantial cost overruns and time delays. It's easier now to say that we have a better handle on our acquisition programs because we have a lot fewer of them, and so they're easier to oversee. But we've made a lot of changes to the acquisition process. If I had more time, that would be a primary focus, to keep working on that. And a big part of it's not just changing what we do internally, it is changing how we interact with, collaborate with, work with those outside the Department of Defense. Technology is, companies and academic centers, they develop technology in a different way than they used to. It's very iterative now, and we aren't generally agile enough to even keep up with that iteration. I mean, we all now we probably were the last people institutionally to hold on to BlackBerries because Apple didn't want to work with us. They said, the product is just one part of it. The software, the updates, it all is a package that goes together, and you are not equipped to receive our technology, and we just can't be bothered. And so I think that's a cautionary tale for how we build, acquire things. I think there's more we can be getting off the shelf and getting in hands, soldiers faster, but also about how we build and acquire larger things.
I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about one of your major achievements as Secretary, which is standing up the Rapid Capabilities Office in the Army. Can you tell everybody what that is, what the structure is, what goals you're hoping to achieve with it, and why it's so important to give the Army the ability to create disruptive technologies in a short amount of time?
There's a lot of, what I say is there's actually a lot of creativity and innovation inside the Department of Defense, in uniform and civilian workforce, among our traditional defense industrial base. There's a lot of creativity, despite the barriers we put up in place of them. So the Rapid Capabilities Office really was, and my job in the Air Force as the Air Force Undersecretary, which is the number 2, a lot of work with the Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office, which is an enormous organization because of all of the Black World programs that are parked in the Air Force and move through this office. The Army's version is different and really was built on what we were seeing the Russians do with Ukraine, and realizing that they had been watching us more closely than maybe we'd been watching them, that they had turned into more of a learning organization than they had been during the Cold War, and that the decisive edge we want in capability maybe wasn't what we had tracked it to be. And so the way I describe our Rapid Capabilities Office, and nobody's allowed to call it the RCO, we're drawing a line at acronyms with the Rapid Capabilities Office, is that it fills a gap in time. And I use a helicopter as an example. We're not going to enlarge the Rapid Capabilities Office to something that can build an entire helicopter. But there might be some capability on that helicopter that we need to pull out and accelerate to field it faster for the existing fleet that we've got. And so we're really looking at a 1 to 5 year time horizon to plug gaps. And I don't know, in some cases there are gaps, in some places it's to get that decisive edge back in capability. Right. And if it's aligned right, it's not meant to be a workaround to the big existing acquisition process. We still need to keep working on that. But if these things are aligned right, then the technology and capability we can get out in the Rapid Capabilities Office will inform the more strategic modernization that's taking place over a longer term.
So it's a building block, in other words.
It's a building block, yeah.
Due to frequent deployments and repeated deployments because of the global war on terror, many service members have come back, obviously, with severe physical injuries, but also have returned with what is sometimes called invisible injuries, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression. The Army has endured for the past several years an elevated suicide rate. Can you talk about that, and what are the things that are being put in place right now in the Army to try to solve that problem? And are they addressing the underlying problems of culture and stigma?
So I think there's a lot of work being done in this area. There's a lot of focus on it. There's a lot of attention on it. There's a great deal more to be done. There's a lot of research taking place. The Army's partnering with a lot of academic medical communities because we want to understand this better. And I think the stigma is changing. But the more I think about this, we've been focused on trying to get behavioral health, behavioral care further out into operational units so it's more accessible. Someone doesn't have to walk to the corner of an installation to get help, but that it's just there. But I think we need to further radically shape the paradigm, which is not we're going to provide care if you need it, but you're going to need care when you come back. What we ask soldiers to do on a regular basis, deployment after deployment, goes against how we're hardwired biologically as human beings. And so it shouldn't be, it's there if you need it, and we're going to make it easy for you to find it. It should be, you're going to need it, and you're going to get it when you come back. It should just be a part of the cycle we have, much like how we maintain tanks, for example. We run them hard, we bring them back, we strip them down, and put them back together. The Special Operations Command has actually done a lot of work in this. That's very interesting. But I think in 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to look back on this time and say, wow, we really missed a lot of things, got a lot of things wrong. And hopefully we'll have an entirely different way of looking at behavioral health that I would be frightened to think we had an army of people doing what we ask of them, and they're not impacted by that mission. I don't even want to know what that would look like. I wouldn't want to let that loose on an adversary someplace, particularly in this environment we're talking about. And so I think we need to, I think we're in the process of looking at this differently, but a lot more work has to be done.
I want to ask you a few questions, two questions about women in the Army. Can you give us an update? Where are we with the expansion of women into all roles in the Army, including combat roles? And where do you see the challenges in that transformation and that change for the Army? And then secondly, an issue that's gotten a lot of attention here on Capitol Hill in the past several years, which is sexual assault in the military. What steps have been taken under your watch as Secretary of the Army to try to solve that problem?
So on the first, women in combat, I think things are going very well. You know, I always brag on the Army on this one because I can do it because a lot of great work was done before I got to the Army to really analyze what requirements are necessary to do all the jobs across the Army. And they are independent of any qualifier of who you are. They're real requirements based on the equipment, the mission, and then opening it up to whoever can meet those requirements. We made a decision in the Army to build the leadership cadre first. So to get new young lieutenants in, to get enlisted to rebranch, who've had some experience, so that when we get brand new junior soldiers in, we've got leadership in place to help make the transition as smooth as possible. And so the challenge, if you even use that word challenge, is just that it was going to take a little bit of time to get some critical mass going in there. But I think it's going very well. We see the women that I see, they're at the vanguard of this, would be the people I'd want fighting with me if I were wearing the uniform in the Army right now. They are impressive, they're dedicated, and they, more than anybody else, want to make sure that the requirements are set and that they meet the requirements. On sexual assault, yeah, I think, you know, there were a lot of titles that were mentioned in my introductions. Some of them were at the same time, but I've had 9 different jobs in this administration, and so I've seen this from every single corner of the Pentagon. And I do think it's been a priority. It's been something. Well, I wouldn't say it's been a priority of mine. It's been a priority of ours to focus on this and get this right. It's critical that we get at this and that we are held to a higher standard, and we should be, and we need to meet that higher standard. And I think where my focus has been in the last year with the Army, the last year plus, has been we have done a lot on the response aspect, making sure that lawyers are trained, judges are trained, we have victims advocates. But we need to make that whole aspect irrelevant by getting at the prevention part. And that's been really my focus the last 18 months as I've moved through the Army jobs, is investing in that part of our organization, pushing the team on the research and on programs to get at the prevention part, which is harder. But I think we're making some progress there.
Terrific. Well, if you hadn't noticed, in the past couple of weeks we had a presidential election. And I think it was a very divisive presidential election. And one of the, I think, good results out of it is that people are trying to stay positive in their personal interactions with each other and also online and social media. So I want to ask a very positive question of you. I've been asking you a lot of hard questions. We're going to celebrate Thanksgiving in 2 days. So what are you most thankful for this year?
Well, my answer to that is the traditional one. But I felt it acutely over the course of the last couple of years with confirmation processes and movements and what have you, and that's my friends and my family. I had, 2 years ago now, I was Under Secretary of the Air Force. The Secretary of the Air Force is one of my oldest, closest, dearest friends. She worked on the House Armed Services Committee with me, and just loving life. And Ash Carter, who I've known for 25 years, came knocking and sets off a 12-month period where I'm in 5 different jobs as I move from the Air Force to him, to the number 2 in the Army, to the acting Secretary of the Army, then back to his office because of the vagaries of the confirmation process. And if I didn't have that sort of stability and those touch points in my personal life, it would have been a much a much different 12 months.
Well, you have just a tremendous resume. You've sat in all these very impressive seats in the Pentagon. Can I ask you what's next in your career? What are the next steps, and where do you think your skills will be best utilized in the future?
Well, I think I have one of the greatest jobs in the world, but very few people really understand the role of a service secretary, which is one of the reasons it's such a great job, because they kind of leave you alone. Generally, if you get a call, something bad has happened and you got to deal with it. But the autonomy that you get as a service secretary is great. And the way I describe it is being the CEO of a business unit. I'm the CEO of the Army. The Army is a unbelievably lethal warfighting machine and a tool of national power. The Department of the Army is a business unit that creates it. Mm-hmm. And so when the confirmation process, now having gone through it twice, it takes a lot out of people who go through it, and I had it relatively easy compared to a lot of people. And so I said, when I get through this and get into this job that I love so much, I'm going to focus on that job until they drag me out of the building, and then I'm going to take a long break someplace warm, and then think about what it is I want to do next. I didn't want to waste any. There's so much you want to do in an organization of 1.4 million people that's in 150 countries in the world, that I didn't want to take a lot of time thinking about what's next. And then any conversation you have, you got to report to the lawyers, and then life gets complicated for you. So, my plan is to do this as long as I'm needed, and then go catch my breath.
Thank you for your service. Now's the time in the program that if we have questions from the audience, we'd be happy to take them. Yes, up front.
The Army budget is about a third of the other services. How it should be, and do you have any explanation for why that is the case?
Well, I'm the Secretary of the Army, so no, it shouldn't be that way. It's not really a third. It is substantially less than the Navy and the Air Force. Now, they're building these enormous platforms. The Army doesn't have aircraft carriers or nuclear bombers or joint strike fighters. Those programs cost more money. But I do think that the Army's and you know what? I've worked through all those departments too. They're struggling as well. I mean, if you think we're out of balance now, look 10 years into the future for the military budget. The entire nuclear apparatus needs to be modernized, recapitalized at the exact same time. You usually want that phased a little bit. The new bomber is going to be coming online, new warheads, entirely new missile system for the Air Force, the new ballistic submarines. That's not. There isn't a plan on how to pay for that yet. So those services have their own programmatic balance issues. The Army is by far the best balance, and that just means you've got risk evenly applied across your budget. But I would argue that we need to increase the modernization budget for the Army, because when I look, the current plan is to modernize existing platforms, but in a time frame that exceeds how long we'd ever plan on keeping and holding on some of these platforms. So I don't look at it as how it's balanced in the pie with the other services. I just think about the pie itself for the entire Department of Defense. I mean, one of the things I do as I move through these jobs, it is never going to win an argument if the Army starts out by comparing itself to the Air Force or the Navy in some way that they're hoping makes them look better. It just never catches water on the Hill or with OSD. But we do have some bills we've pushed into the future. And it's not just modernization, it's installations too. We're underinvesting year after year after year in installations. And it's a certain amount of money to maintain a building, a certain amount to repair it, and then a lot more to replace it, which is what's starting to happen.
I was wondering if there's been a lot of discussion in the defense community about the threat of climate change as a national security issue. And of course, the president has a couple of directives on that front as well. Do you think that is something that is now baked into not just the Army, but the rest of the Defense Department as a threat? And do you think that will continue in the next administration?
I don't know about the next administration. I'm not a part of those conversations. But I do think it's baked into the Department of Defense in a way that's enduring, and for two reasons. We are already seeing it impact our installations. Where are our Navy bases? They're on shores. And so we're already seeing issues in the Army, in the Navy, in the Marine Corps, in the Air Force with our installations. But anyone who looks at the threat environment or the geopolitical environment into the future has got to see that the effects of climate change also are going to create all sorts of instability that we're going to have to deal with. So I do think it feels pretty baked in for me, and it's not just on the political side in this administration. It's in numerous strategy documents that we've been creating over the last few years.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Great. All right. What are your top priorities for the last couple months of your term, and do you have any concerns about how an administration change might change the direction that the Army's headed?
My priorities for the end are the Rapid Capabilities Office. In the next couple of weeks, we will finalize the first round of actual investments for that office. That is a priority. I want to keep talking about behavioral health and see what more I can do to keep moving in that direction of the paradigm shift that I talked about. And then I'm very proud of the different ways that we have opened up service to those who'd been denied the opportunity in the past. And continuing to make sure that that's going smoothly will be an important part of whatever time that I have left. I think, the dramatic changes that I've seen in my career with the Department of Defense, because when I said I'm the CEO of a business unit, again, I create a product. Other people decide how to use that product. I'm way oversimplifying, of course. But that's where you get dramatic changes from one government to another, which is how you're using the military in the context of foreign policy and all the tools you've got in the toolbox. It's a complex world out there with lots of threats swirling, and so I'm not sure what the new administration will decide and how they want to tackle some of those problems.
Back.
Hi, Scott Massioni with Federal News Radio. Talent management has been something that Ash Carter's really been focusing on, and I think he's been bringing up some of the promotion board issues. The Army was in the news with promotion boards because Lieutenant Riley, who was a Rhodes Scholar, was almost passed over for his promotion board until Chief of Staff Milley got involved. I was just wondering, one, do you think that the next, whoever's going to be in charge of the Army next will be able to recognize that problem, since the Force of the Future has had such problems with Republicans? And two, what more do you plan to do in the realm of talent management in your final days?
I think there are certain issues we're working on that someone might choose a different approach, but I feel like there's a shared recognition that the issues are important. The Force of the Future initiatives, I think are important at, Secretary Carter's imagining what a workforce is going to look like in 20 years, and doesn't necessarily see that the Department of Defense is going to be an attractive place as it exists now for people to work for. And I think some of these changes are important, but it's broader than just changing, our uniformed workforce and our career civilian workforce. I think we have to think much more creatively about what a workforce is and how we access it. And it might be temporary. It's how we interact with industry differently, with academia differently. I think we've got to get much more creative at breaking down barriers, which is really what he's focused on. General Milley and I have talked a lot about talent management on the uniform side, and I think there are some relatively easy fixes to get at some of these things, so that a lieutenant who's got a degree from Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar doesn't get passed over. And part of that is just maybe allowing a little bit more time in the process. The Army is massive, and these boards move through names very quickly. And so some of that nuance can be lost. And Secretary Carter's been focused on trying to give people opportunities, career development opportunities, broadening opportunities, But we still have these poll years, and it can be hard for people in uniform to take a year or 2 years and actually believe that they may come back onto the track, their career advancement is not going to be hindered. And so we're looking at ways to make sure that that people who take advantage of those opportunities, that it impacts in a positive way their career and their career trajectory.
Mark? Mm-hmm.
Secretary, you spoke about the active Army, National Guard. How do you see the role of the National Guard changing in this future Army?
So it's interesting. I start in the Department of the Navy, which has 2 services, and as one admiral described them, yes, they're sister services, the Navy and Marine Corps, but they're orphan children adopted from separate families. And then I go to the Air Force and think, okay, now I've got it easy. It's one service, and then I run into the politics of the Guard. Then I think I have it all figured out, and I go to the Army, and we have the Corps of Engineers, which is then a whole other political grab bag. But first is we cannot do what we're asked to do. The Army cannot do what it's asked to do if it doesn't think as a total force and work as efficiently and effectively as a total force. The active component just couldn't do everything that's being asked of it. Second of all, people join the Guard for different reasons today than they did 15 years ago. One thing I keep reminding, a lot of these issues that we focus on, we deal with, are really generational. And 9/11 was a call to service for a lot of people. And people who join the Guard want to be operational in a way that I don't think was necessarily the same case 40 years ago. And so senior uniformed leadership maybe remembers an older Guard. The colonels now, like my colonels in the back, they know the new Guard, because you go downrange now, you go out into the field, you can't tell whether someone's Guard, reserve, or active unless you ask. And then the more junior officers on a lot of issues, this being one of them, just look at me like I'm crazy for even asking the question, like we're already doing it. And so the future of the Guard is integral to the Army. And I think we're getting much better at all of the different, it can be very political because the governors have an agenda for the Guard. We have an agenda for the Guard. The adjutant generals of the Guard, there's the Guard Bureau, there's the Hill. Someone once described the active Army is the President's Army and the Guard is Congress's Army. But we've set up a lot of mechanisms to increase communication and collaboration. And it got so bad that the Air Force was asked, that the Congress stood up a commission on the future of the Air Force, and I was in the Air Force and got to live through that, and moved over to the Army just in time to deal with the Army's commission on the future. But one of the things that came out of that is this thing called the Council of Governors, and it's been a very effective mechanism with about 10 governors and Department of Defense leadership and DHS leadership to work through these issues, because going back to what I said at the start, we cannot do what we're asked to do if we don't think of ourselves as a total force.
I think we have time for one more question. Right up here. Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the force structure and defense budget going back over the last quarter century, it looks like there's a pretty clear pattern. And if you read budget documents published at various institutions around town, you'd see the same pattern, which is that pretty much any given force structure the United States has seems to somehow require annual real increases in defense spending of 2 or 3% to sustain it, no matter what, year in, year out. So given how much management experience you've had, what's the story on this? Because I can't really find a consistent story on why this appears to be the case.
Well, a couple things. If I could just broaden that a little bit and say, I think there's a few reasons for that. One is we don't manage that way. We don't manage. In my experience in the last 8 years, we haven't even managed with annual budgets. We're under a continuing resolution right now. We've started every single year with a continuing resolution, which is a very disruptive and expensive way to govern, to manage. If we really took a 25-year period, snapped the chalk line, and then went 2 to 3% a year, you'd get more out of your budget, or your program, I think, than the way we manage now, where there's no predictability. There's no reliability to the budget. You can't manage the Department of Defense on a series of 12-month cycles. You certainly can't, it's very difficult to manage it on a series of 3-month and then 9-month cycles, and now we're going to get a continuing resolution that takes us in probably into 6 months. That costs a lot of money to govern that way, and people don't understand the impacts. This will be the first administrative transition under a continuing resolution, and people. My predecessor, John McHugh, was a member of Congress for many years, and he said he thought a CR was a good thing because it kept the spigot open. Well, all it does is let you spend what you spent last year. So if you got any new program in your budget, you're not authorized to spend on it. What does that do to your people? What does it do to contracts? What does it do to the industrial base? It adds costs year after year after year to operate in such fiscal confusion. And to me, that's a big part of it. Now, the 25-year period, the Berlin Wall falls, we took a knee a little bit because you decide, okay, the world is stable enough that I can take a little bit of a risk and invest in something different. We haven't been able to do that these last 15 or 20 years. We haven't been able to take that balance where, okay, we've got a little bit less risk geopolitically, so we can take some risks in being ready in order to invest in modernization, and you kind of balance that out over these curves in a 25 or longer year period. So we haven't had that, and we end every fiscal year preparing for a shutdown. Very inefficient operation environment for the military the last 8 years.
Mr. Secretary, on behalf of the Library of Congress, thank you for your time this morning, and most importantly, thank you for your service, and we wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.